Mandi de Mestre is just going to give us the last presentation this afternoon, which is going to be on umbilical cord torsion and what we've learnt about it. So I'll hand over to Mandi.
Sticking around for the last sort of session of the day and sticking it through. So what I'd really like to sort of move and talk about is to a later phase of pregnancy and some work that we've been doing to try and understand umbilical cord torsion. And this is something we've come to much more recently than our work on early pregnancy loss. And it really came from coming up here to Newmarket and talking to sort of stakeholders and veterinarians and learning a bit more about this, because I must say when I moved here to the UK from Australia then the US, I hadn't really heard much about this condition. It was something you don't read about much in the literature. And so we teamed up with Professor Ken Smith at the college, who's at the RBC, is a pathologist, and Alistair Foote here at Rossdale's laboratories, along with Kristen Verheyen, who's an epidemiologist at the RBC, to try and sort of understand this a little bit more. And remarkably, I would say when we looked into the literature sort of 5 years ago to plan the project, there was practically nothing in the literature about this. There's some descriptive studies, there's some sort of incidents at a pathology lab level, but we felt we had a really open book. So I'm going to tell you up front, I'm not going to tell you all the answers to this. I think what we've done is built the sort of foundations of the house, so to speak, in trying to get data to teach us to which direction we should be going in. So I'm going to take you through some of that data today. But essentially, this is the problem, and there's some images here from some colleagues that have kindly shared them here of umbilical cord torsion. So essentially, this is where you get excessive torsion of the umbilical cord leading to vascular compromise and fetal death and abortion. Or maybe not, and by the end I'm going to talk a little bit about the complexities of this condition, and it might not be just as simple as this. So I'm going to start with our epidemiological studies, thinking about how common umbilical cord torsion is and some of the approaches that I would really strongly encourage others to use. We found them very useful. Then thinking about what's normal about the umbilical cord and establishing those parameters, and then moving on our gross and histological features. So how do we define a cord torsion, and how can we use that information to understand the underlying reasons for these cord torsions? So this is some study at work that Jessica Roach did. So I should say that once this work was funded by Alvarado Trust, and we appointed Jessica Roach, who is a PhD student who has just, for those that know her, defended her PhD very excitingly, did very well. So all the data I'll talk about today is the work that Jessica's done, and she's also just had a baby boy 2 weeks ago. So she's out busy with that at the moment. But the first thing we did is we wanted to found the groundwork of the incidence in our populations here. So these are thoroughbreds here in the UK and Ireland, and this is looking at the incidence of pregnancy loss once we know they're confirmed at day 70. So this is moving beyond our early period. How often are those lost? And we broke it into 3 periods. Abortion less than 300 days. We looked at 300 to 315, the intermediary period, and 315 and later. Now these included stillbirths and perinatal deaths, and the reason for that is actually when you go into the literature and records, it's really hard, and we've tried this over and over, to actually say whether this was a stillbirth or did it die shortly after birth. So that's why we've grouped ours, and we were confident that they died within 24 hours of birth. So that's what this group includes here. And you can see here, we've done it over 5 years here. This is, off the top of my head, 3,500 pregnancies in about 1,800 mares, so it's a relatively large population. These are generally, I think we had 31 stud farms contribute data to this, so it's a relatively large number of farms. And what we found on average is around 4% here of pregnancies failed after being confirmed at day 70. And whilst there was some year-to-year variation, if you looked here at the incidence, if you looked at the 95% confidence intervals here, they were well and truly overlapping. So there was no significant changes that we could detect year on year. Now, you also, some of you, particularly at stud farms, would be interested in the live foal incidence. So we saw this fluctuate between about 92 and 94%. So that's the chance of a mare delivering a live foal to 24 hours if she was confirmed pregnant and got through that early period to 70 days. It's really hard to compare. Sort of, a lot of these studies are done a bit like comparing apples and oranges, so it's hard to sort of directly compare the incidence across regions. But there was a study it wasn't too dissimilar, just done in Australia, and they just found 3.9% of pregnancies that were failing after this period. So it's not dissimilar to what we see here in the UK. So what are the causes of these pregnancy losses? And actually, I've pulled out the same paper that Karen shared with you earlier. This has just come out, this meta-analysis, to show you the breadth of causes that are reported worldwide. And EHV is certainly the dominant one here. But what's interesting is trying to think about this at a relatively local area. So if you look regionally, this is going to change substantially. I'm going to show you what we found here in this area. The other thing that was curious from this data is actually the very first studies of umbilical cord torsion were back in 1930. So this is very much not a new condition that's been described. These earlier studies originated here very early on. It's the green line here. So you can see here these are reported throughout the decades. So what did we find here in the UK and Ireland in thoroughbred mares as causes of abortion? So what we've done in this study, and I just want to sort of point out how it differs to some of the data you might have seen previously, is we wanted to look at the sort of a cohort of mares that we knew were pregnant and then quantify these causes looking at the whole population. So this is not what's been presented to a pathology lab, which might have variations based on sort of increases in an infectious cause and you see a relative decrease in cord torsions. We can do this at a population level. So you can see here that what we found, if we looked over here on the total and we've looked across 5 years here, umbilical cord related pathology associated with abortion is by far the most common cause. So it was 1.5% of established pregnancies at day 30 were subsequently lost due to a cord pathology. So if you're thinking about on your farms, that would be, you'd mean to expect on average you might get 3 cases of cord torsion per 200 mares that you would have under management. And that would be meaning you're hitting sort of the wider sort of industry levels that are observed in this wider population. What was also interesting, if you look here on the right at these smaller contributors, if you look here at infectious placentitis, and Karen sort of pointed this out earlier, which is a really interesting difference. While we have really high rates of cord torsion, you can see our incidence of infectious placentitis is 0.3% of pregnancies that go on abort. There might be higher rates, there will be higher rates of mares that had placentitis, but they didn't abort. Equine herpes virus is similar, so all these other causes are quite similar. It sits around 0.3% here of pregnancies. Pathologies associated with the fetus, a similar level again around 0.2%, and then no primary diagnosis in this population was relatively small actually. So in our population it was around 0.2%. Generally, the cord torsions, there was a drop here in 2015, but otherwise, year on year, there was no significant difference. Although I was just speaking to someone earlier, what I did see last in 2021 is I had about 5 different phone calls from veterinarians out in practices talking to me about cord torsions. So I haven't got data on that, but I would be curious to actually look at what happened last season and see if that was a genuine spike or would that be falling under these numbers here. Now we've got this, what can we do with it? Well, we can actually monitor this over the time. So we can say, is there genuinely a change? Because we know the numbers we would expect per number of mares. So therefore we can say in 2021, what number aborted and has that changed? And then obviously when we understand the underlying causes and we want to put in interventions, we can also monitor the incidence as well. So I think this is we find this really useful data and it could be applied to a number of other conditions. So let's move on. Now we've got the numbers, let's move on to what's normal when it comes to the cord. So this is, many will be familiar with this, but just to get you thinking about the condition again, here we have sort of a diagram that was produced a number of years ago. And you can see here we have the fetus, and we've got the amniotic portion of the umbilical cord here within the amnion or the allantoamnion here. We've got an allantoic portion here of the umbilical cord, and then the allantochorion or chorioallantois around the outside. So if we're thinking about cord torsion, the first thing to think about is where could it twist? So if you think about it here, this fetus could twist in either direction really here within the amnion. So therefore the twisting is in this segment here, or the fetus within the amnion could twist, and therefore you'd get twisting here in the allantoic part. So they're the two things we could consider with cord torsion. Here is an example here of so this is the amniotic portion. This would be the fetal attachment here, the amnion coming off here, and the allantoic portion here. And this has been described, there's numbers that have been described for the size. They're long, these cords in the horse, but you can see numbers have been established for thoroughbred, standardbred, and warm blood. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the numbers that we've come up with in the study that Jessica's done. The other thing to remember about umbilical cords is twisting is normal. And so a couple of studies have quantified this, and we haven't, I'll tell you why in a minute, but of 157 pregnancies, they found 22 of these pregnancies had no evidence of torsion, but 78% had some degree of coiling of the cord. So this is indeed a normal process, and what they found in standardbreds and thoroughbreds, on average there were 5 twists, and in warm bloods 6. So this is sort of would be considered in a healthy delivery, what you might see. In these previous studies, they found an increased length was associated with an increased number of coils. Now, before I get on to the results later, I'm going to let it out now that we actually didn't count coils in our study, which might seem a little counterintuitive, really thinking, why aren't you counting the twists? But we had a great debate as a team, and then we came up with a consensus that actually, by the time these come in to us, we can't reliably count them. And it's not probably going to be about the twists, it's about the consequences of the twists. So rather than produce sort of dodgy data, we decided we just wouldn't even go there. So I'm not going to tell you about the twist, and I don't think it's necessarily just about the twist anyway. So what we first did, so Jessica, and this has taken a number of years to do, but the first thing Jessica did was actually think about normal cord development over gestation. So one of the limitations to the data we could find out in the literature is most of it was done on term placenta, so delivery, which is understandable. So we had some parameters established for there, but we didn't really know what happened across time. And so colleagues around the UK, when they've had a mare die during pregnancy due to another cause, a fractured leg or something, have actually submitted the pregnancy to us, and that's allowed us to establish some parameters here. So it's taken about 5 years to get these numbers, but you can see here that we've been able to track the amniotic portion of the cord and its length, and over here the allantoic portion and its length here across gestation and relative to the crown lump length at the bottom here. Now the first thing that really surprised us was this, is that if you looked at the allantoic portion, it was fixed in length by 100 days of gestation. So actually very early on, the length is determined, and there was no evidence that we were getting an increased lengthening of the cord from very early on. But if we looked at the amniotic portion here, you can see here that it's really not till 200 days that the length of the cord is fixed. So you can see exponential growth here, and then it plateaus here from around about 200 days, whether we look at crown rump length or gestation age. So this is a bit different. In women, for example, we see more of a linear change in cord over time. The first thing, so what does this actually tell us? So I think it was really interesting. We started then hypothesizing about where this origin was. Remember, I just said it could be in the amniotic sac, they twist, or the whole thing twisting. So the fact it was actually lengthening within the amniotic portion gave us some sort of evidence that it's likely to be twisting primarily within that amniotic portion, and that's where the lengthening may come in. And we know there's a lot of fetal movement between this 100 and 200 days. When we looked at total umbilical cord length here, we divided it here into centiles, and you can see here It ranged here from 31 to 85 centimetres. One of the sort of hypotheses we'd heard talked about when we're talking to people in the field, when you're starting to see these more, is maybe sort of genetically over time we're breeding for mares with longer cords. And, you know, that seems a reasonable assumption if we're more aware of it. But actually, these were figures done in the 1970s by Catherine Whitwell and Jeffcott, and what they found here is the range that they gave for normal was 36 to 83 centimetres for the 95th percentile, so there's 95 percentile here. That would be the equivalent of 35.4 to 73.6 here if we do the equivalent measures that they used. So actually we didn't have any evidence that these cords are actually getting longer. If anything, in this group we looked at, they were slightly shorter. The other thing of note here related to this change in length of the amniotic cord over time is when we considered this in regard to when cord torsions occur. So this is, if we look here on the right here, umbilical cord torsions. These are non-umbilical cord torsions in our study, so these are other causes of pregnancy loss here. And this is gestation age or month of gestation along here. So what we found is actually about 78% of umbilical cord torsions are failing between 180 to 240 days, okay? So that is immediately after this lengthening period here between 100 and 200 days. So that was curious to us that you're getting that much longer cord, and then that would fit with the fact that there's capacity then for that cord to twist or occlude or have some sort of consequences from the lengthening. So now let's have a think about those consequences. So not surprisingly, I won't dwell on this too much, is what sort of characteristics did we have of the cord torsions? And you know, as you would expect here, if you look down here, the total cord length and the cord torsions are significantly longer. This on the median here is 79 centimetres. And what was also interesting to us here in the cord torsion group, it was actually, again, the amniotic length that was significantly different compared to non-cord torsions, but not the allantoic length. So again, this sort of fits with that data about normal pregnancy again, that it's something to do with that amniotic cord that is associated or resulting in this condition. The other thing was sort of curious for us is that the umbilical cord circumference was significantly increased in these cord torsions. So if you just had like a normal stretching, you might expect no significant increase in diameter, but actually these cords not only were longer, but they were fatter essentially. And that was curious to us, and I'll come back to that in a sec. So if we look at just to sort of look at these figures in a little bit of a different way too, when we looked at Jessica looked at amniotic to allantoic ratio here over different conditions, and you can look at these are cord torsions. This is ischemic necrosis that Karen just mentioned. These were non-umbilical cord torsions here, control pregnancies and term placenta. So you can see these three groups here. The ratio here is sitting around 1, but if we look in both cord torsions and ischemic necrosis, you can see the median ratio is significantly increased compared to the other groups. And in some of these cases here, the amnion is substantially longer than the allantoic cord as well. The other factor that we sort of looked at, which might infer some sort of stretching, is the navel stump length here. So when this was measured, you can see here it's significantly longer here in the umbilical cord torsions and the ischemic necrosis, and much shorter here in our two control groups. So this again would provide some sort of weight to stretching. So one of the challenges when we were going into this was there are two ways to look at these groups and try and understand the pathology and the underlying causes. One is to look at an umbilical cord torsion versus one that's not, and that's something we have done and I have been talking about. But one of the challenges with that is that's already a diagnosis made by the pathologists by how they have decided that diagnosis. So it could possibly, I'm not saying it is, but it could possibly be biased in one way or the other based on how they make that diagnosis. So we wanted to additionally add into the analysis a sort of more objective way to look at umbilical cords and see if we could understand more about them. And we did this by looking at two groups, looking at the excessively long cord, irrespective of whether they failed or not. We just wanted to say what happens in a really long cord versus a normal length cord. What are the consequences of that? So what Jessica did here is she took the cords that were greater than in the top percentile here, so these are the 99th percentile or greater, and then we took cords down here in this, essentially the 75th percentile down to the 2.5 percentile here. We left out these because we were worried the short cords, if there was an extremely short cord, we might get some sort of changes there that might cloud the data. So we compared this group here with the extreme cord length. So we call these excessively long and these normal. Now, there was a mixture of outcomes in here, although undoubtedly the predominant group that falls into the excessively long, which is interesting in itself, are the umbilical cord torsions or suspected. We also had the long cord ischemic necrosis, and then we had a small number of other, which included a dystocia, something of fetal origin, an undiagnosed abortion, and we had one term placenta. And then in our normal down here, we had our controls. We had our infectious placentitis, the dystocia undiagnosed. There's quite a few of these in this group. And we had one other ischemic necrosis falling into this group. So let's have a look at what they look like. Well, not surprisingly, that these actually, again, had significantly longer cord length, which is what we selected on. But what I wanted to highlight here is these, again, are much fatter. So the circumference of these excessively long cords, whether they're associated with a cord torsion or not, was increased. So being long can lead to an increased cord. So we wanted to sort of quantify this. So Jessica has done a lot of histology, and we've also had some help very kindly from the technicians at Rostel's laboratories as well to process. I think we've got like 2,000 slides. There's a huge number of slides sitting in the lab at the moment. But what she wanted to do in the context of the circumference is see if we can quantify what we saw in the gross circumference with what we see histologically. So we went here, this is mid-amniotic umbilical cord here, okay, and she took a histological section through here, and we looked at the normal umbilical cord length versus excessively long, and you can see the whole section area is actually essentially double here in the excessively long cords. And then we also found the umbilical vein lumen area was increased. The umbilical artery, both of these arteries had also an increase in area. Now this was the p-values comparing the excessively long to the normal, but interestingly, if we look at the umbilical cord torsions versus not, they were also significantly different. So this is a finding that was common to having an excessively long cord and also an umbilical cord torsion. So there's a couple of questions that are following up, and I think are going to, what we're interested in doing next on this is, can we detect this change along the length of the amniotic cord? We've looked in one section, but to make this clinically relevant, we'd need to look along the cord. And could we use this as a predictor of an umbilical cord torsion? So is this something we can measure? And I'd point to sort of colleagues such as Karen and Andrew who have talked about this over the last couple of days, whether we can actually go in and measure the diameter of these cords and then follow the outcome of these pregnancies and see if this could be used as early detection, for example. And we also know when the cord's lengthening, so we would be looking at doing this sort of in that 100 to 200 days. We looked at other characteristics grossly, as well as paternal and maternal characteristics associated with excessively long cords. And interestingly, the main thing that came up, maternal age came up as a factor that led to an increased median cord length. But also we found that the median number of previous years covered was increased in those mares that had an excessively long cord. And if Jessica went on and did some logistic regression, so some additional statistics to try and quantify this in a slightly different way. So if we compare a maiden mare, for example, to a mare that's been bred for 1 season or 2 seasons or 3 seasons, we didn't see any statistically significant difference in these two compared to maidens, but there was a nearly 10-fold increase in risk if mares have been bred for 3 seasons to have an excessively long cord. So this is consistent with some work done many years ago by Catherine Whitwell and James Wood, and they looked at cord length at term. So these were in healthy pregnancies, and they actually found multiparous mares were associated with increased cord length. But this has not been repeated in warm bloods and standard breds at term. But this is really curious. So this suggests to us that maybe there will be a contribution of having maybe a larger uterus, and then there's more space for the fetus to move, and that might be one of the risk factors here. So we've got so much data, I just didn't want to sort of overwhelm you with too much today, but what I've tried to do here is sort of summarise some of the key things that Jessica found that were shared features that were changed in both an excessively long umbilical cord and an umbilical cord torsion group compared to their controls. And these numbers here are sort of odds, so they're increased odds that these characteristics will be present in these two groups. And you can see here at the top here, we've got chorioallantoic reddening or amniotic reddening. So this suggests that there is congestion and some sort of stasis in those two membranes. And it also in both the excessively long and more markedly in the umbilical cord torsions. We also found evidence of umbilical cord stretch marks here, so this would be related to the twisting, and an increased chance of finding urachal dilations. Now together, this has let us hypothesize that there appears to be venous stasis as a main feature. This had been discussed before, but we've got some nice data now to sort of support this. The other thing that was quite interesting is that gross thrombi were also noted in the chorioallantoic vessels of the excessively long cords, and these were never seen in a normal cord length. So again, that's additional data suggesting that when you've got a long cord, you have an increased chance of venous stasis. So this takes me back to, I think it's 1st and 2nd year vet school, so it's a long time now, but thinking about vascular resistance created by length and increased resistance will lead to venous stasis, and we'll see this in the various placental membranes in the cord itself. The other thing of note, which has been used by pathologists, but we were able to sort of quantify this as well, is we notice villous mineralization. So this is changes within the chorioallantois, and this would be suggestive that the conditions could well be subacute to chronic. So we're starting to hypothesize now there's probably a couple of groups here. You might have your acute torsions, twist, really complete occlusion very quickly, and they're aborted possibly quickly. But actually probably the great majority of these are some sort of subacute or chronic condition related to the excessively long cord as much as the twists. But what was interesting for us is there is, independent of the presence and twists in this cord, we can see significant gross and histological changes in both the chorioallantois and the placenta and the cords of these pregnancies. So there is something sort of tangible we can use now, and the next step is to try and get a diagnostic criteria, a consensus agreement, so we can then do larger studies across larger regions to really understand the risk factors. On that note, the risk factors really is something we're particularly interested in tackling, and a number of you might have already contributed surveys for which we're incredibly appreciative of, trying to understand the risk factors for umbilical cord torsion. This is a work in progress, so this is really preliminary data because I don't think we have enough power yet to look at all the variables we're really interested in. But one of them that has come out already as the main thing that's come out here is the number of previous abortions a mare has, and this is not looking at the type of abortion, increases her risk of an umbilical cord torsion. And so you can see here we've got maiden none. If she's had 1 or 2 or more previous abortions, you can see here the proportion of umbilical cord goes up. And this also represents, when we do logistic regression, about a 2.5-fold increase in risk of that mare associated with a umbilical cord torsion. Again, I'd put this up, this is a slightly different way to look at the data, but we also looked by year of cover in this slightly different population, and you can see, as I said earlier, there's maybe a drop down here, but generally there was no variation by year. And when we put this into our models, statistical models, we couldn't see in certainly this 5-year period an effective year. So that just brings me to sum up. Now this is Jessica's final thesis figure. So after sort of 4 years of work, she did a beautiful job. So I thought I really should share this, sort of trying to summarize all the data that she's brought together. But this is sort of our current hypotheses. So you can see here, between 100 and 200 days, we've found that this amniotic cord length is increasing over this period here. And by 200 days, that we believe that this is where we define whether we have an excessively long umbilical cord. Now we know the factors that can affect this length will be mere parity and to some extent age, but in particularly mere parity. And so we've got this amniotic cord growing bigger, but what's going to drive it? Well, we think possibly increased uterine volume. There's a question mark about male fetus, because in our data we didn't see an effect of sex, but other people have shown that with male fetuses they think are more associated with umbilical cord torsions. I want to wait till we have more data till we're conclusive on that one. Whether there's a genetic predisposition, so the length of that cord, maybe there is genetics here, and that's what we're about to start to look at actually. So there is an initial longer starting point, and then all these things happen. Or maybe you can have a normal starting point, but excessive movement and an excessively large uterus. So it's possibly going to be a combination. And there'll be like a trigger point, which affects the excessively long development. And then you could think of some sort of stimulant for the fetus, so fetal hyperkinesis, so in other words, something that causes that fetus to move more might result in more stretching, which is why we see some of that evidence of stretching. If we look within this excessively long umbilical cord, we had 76.2% of these will go on and be aborted in our umbilical cord torsion group, and a further 14% fall into this long cord with ischemic necrosis. So a significant portion of these, if they have these long cords, will be lost at the end of the day. But we have 2.4% here that can go on and result in the delivery of a live foal. So I guess it depends on the degree of pathology we're seeing. But in the majority of cases, they will be lost. Interestingly, with these excessively long, 7.1% were also pregnancy loss, but for another non-attributed umbilical cord cause. The other thing I just wanted to highlight before I finish up too is these umbilical cord torsions and when they're occurring. So if you look at here, we've got our movement through here, and then we've got 70.8% here of these cord torsions occurring in this period here immediately afterwards. So what we think is there may be a window here for umbilical cord torsion diagnosis. You're not going to pick up all of them, but you could pick up a good number of them by starting to understand pregnancy in this earlier period here, where we might traditionally have been focusing on placentitis and monitoring them much later. And what sort of things could we target and develop is thinking about the cross-section of the umbilical cord, particularly in the amniotic portion. We could look at the size of the vein and the artery, and also we can measure amniotic umbilical cord vascularization. So we actually found actual changes in the cord itself, suggesting there was increased vascularization in the cord. And possibly, is there going to be decreased blood flow? We'd have to look at the vascular dynamics too. So I think that's where we'd really like to head in our next stages looking forward. So that just brings me to sort of acknowledge our funders for this work, our Borada Trust, and in particular, this was very much a team effort between Alistair Foote, Jill Bryan, and Matt at Rossdale's, who've all processed huge numbers of samples here and are absolutely critical to all this work. Our work collaborators at the RBC, and in particular, Jessica, who did it all. So thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to people about what they think about how we can scan these cords. Thanks for your time.